As Russia's President Vladimir Putin touches down in New Delhi to meet with India's Narendra Modi, behind the handshakes and smiles, it's a critical moment for each of these global players. It's a delicate balancing act for India, and for Russia, a chance to come in from the cold. I'm Hazem Sika, and this is today's Newsmakers. It is a relationship that goes back decades, from the days of the Soviet Union and India's emergence as a young independent nation. India has historically tried to balance itself between different global partners. Putin's visit comes at a moment when that pragmatism is tested as it tries to counter China's power and navigate a U.S. trade war. For Russia and Putin, isolated by the West over the war in Ukraine, it's a chance to show he's still a player on the world stage. Here's more on what's at stake for both these countries.
Rarely are red carpet visits such a tightrope to walk, but for India, President Vladimir Putin's first visit since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a balancing act is exactly what Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will have to pull off. With the largest population in the world, India has long prided itself on a completely unaligned, independent foreign policy. But Donald Trump's tariffs have put India in an awkward spot. The US is its biggest export market, and tariffs on India were a spanner in the works for its huge manufacturing export economy.
The tariff imposed on Russia, on India by USA has slightly, unnerved us. Unnerved us in many ways because many of the traditional exporters are now out of job. The people dependent on those manufacturing garments, for example, are now jobless. So they are looking for avenues.
Trump and Modi often show an obvious, warm, close, personal friendship during face-to-face meetings, and Modi has shown a willingness to keep Trump happy, to a certain point. But India's unaligned foreign policy has meant that India and Russia have often pursued a friendly pragmatism over trade and relations with each other. And this suits Russia quite well. Speaking ahead of his visit, Putin said that he wanted to increase cooperation even further.
This is the objective of numerous joint projects in energy, industry, space, agriculture and other sectors. We will also discuss these topics in detail during the upcoming visit to India with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, including increasing imports of Indian goods to our market.
Despite sanctions, Russian oil via shadow fleets and foreign trade with countries more reluctant to fully enact embargoes have meant the economic squeeze on Moscow's finances isn't as suffocating as the US and Europe want it to be. And while Modi has reduced India's dependence on Russian oil, when it comes to defence spending, India is likely to allow pragmatism to outshine any ideological concerns. China, India's biggest strategic rival, has proven only too happy to sell fighter jets to India's biggest security rival, Pakistan. The short war between India and Pakistan earlier this year has only sharpened India's focus on bolstering its defence and military capabilities. Putin will almost certainly capitalise on this, and concerns about keeping the US happy simply won't win over concerns about Pakistan.
In the current global scenario, we are subject to terrorism and other problems. So it is important to build ties with Russia. Russia has from time to time helped us. If they had not provided us with their air defense systems, then our situation would have been different, given the attacks by other nations over India. Therefore, it's a good move and the defense deal should be signed so that all the latest technology reaches India.
Red carpet visits are not normally such a delicate balancing act. But for India, walking this tightrope isn't a choice. It's an unavoidable necessity.
All right, so to discuss that and more, let's go to our panel. Joining me now to debate this from New Delhi, we have distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, Nandan Unrakrishnan from Moscow, Deputy Foreign Editor at Komsomolskaya Pravda daily newspaper, Dmitry Babich, and completing our panel from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, President of the Delphi Global Research Center and retired U.S. Army Colonel Robert Hamilton. Good to have you all with us. Dmitry, let me start with you. What do you think Putin is hoping to get out of this visit?
I think there are at least three goals. One is to show that Russia is not really isolated on the world stage, because we just recently had a visit of Putin to China. We had visits to Mongolia, to a lot of Central Asian republics. And now India. Let me remind you that the last visit was in 2021, when basically, there was still no war in Ukraine, at least it didn't pass into the current terrible stage. So basically, this is the first goal, to show that Russia is not isolated. The second goal is military technical cooperation. You know that India has been buying Russian weapons for many years, and certainly India is interested in S-400 and Su-35, fighter jets, other arms from Russia. And the third subject is economy. India has shown itself to be a sovereign country which does not bow to pressure from the United States and continues to trade with Russia. The legal ground for that is very solid, because India basically tells Mr. Trump that you can subject Russia or any other country to your own sanctions, but you cannot sanction the countries which continue to trade with Russia. So I think this is a principal matter. By inviting President Putin, India is showing that it is a sovereign country and that it basically sticks with the international law, which has no room for the so-called secondary sanctions. So these are the three main goals, I would say.
All right, well, you didn't bring up a number of issues there we can get into. The isolation issue is certainly an interesting one, and I want to come back to that with you a little bit later. But let's get the view from India now. Nandan, how significant is this for your country? It's a difficult balancing act that Modi has to do here, isn't it?
Yeah, well, given the kind of relationship that Russia is currently having with the West, it is a balancing act that India has to perform, particularly because India is, in the past few years, been moving closer to the West in terms of economic relationships, as well as, in some cases, like in the Indo-Pacific, the security relationship. So it is a balancing act, but at the same time, India at no stage plans to give up its relationship with Russia. In other words, it's not going to walk away from Moscow. And the summit mechanism is 25 years old. I mean, this is the 23rd summit, the annual summit. So I don't think this would be viewed as something extraordinary, at least in India. And the Indian public, as well as Indian policymakers, I suspect, have very warm feelings towards Russia, and particularly towards Mr. Putin. So he is bound to get a warm reception.
Robert Hamilton, no doubt the U.S. will be keeping a close eye on this. What will people in the administration there in Washington be looking at?
Sure. So obviously the White House is not thrilled about a Modi-Putin summit, but also not surprised. As Nandan said, this is the 23rd of these mostly annual summits. So what I think the White House wants, and it understands that this is instrumental for both India and for Russia. For Russia, as Dmitry said, it's an attempt to show that Russia is not actually isolated on the world stage. India is one of a number of countries that Putin can go to where, at one, he's welcome, and two, he won't be arrested because of the International Criminal Court warrant against him. He can only go to countries essentially that aren't ICC members or that are willing to suspend the ICC warrant and not arrest him when he lands. So India is one of those. And then, as Dmitry said, trade is part of this. I think both sides, but especially Russia, want to see the trade relationship strengthened. India had increased significantly its imports of Russian oil after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. because of the price cap on Russian oil. It was cheaper. And so for India, it was just a sort of a self-interested instrumental move to import more Russian oil. But India's imports of Russian oil have gone down since the U.S. put a 25% tariff on Indian imports to the U.S. So I think there'll be an attempt to find ways to burnish the trade relationship, to improve it. Oil may be one of those, but again, there's a cost to India for continuing to import Russian oil. So probably defense tech will be something that they'll talk about increasing, but there are problems there too because of the sanctions. Russia's not able to produce as much for export, arms for export, as it used to. And frankly, it's having trouble meeting its own needs in Ukraine. So there's probably not a lot left that it can export to partners like India.
Nandan, let me come back to you on this. We talked earlier about the balancing act that India is trying to manage here, pursuing this policy of strategic autonomy, if you like, looking out for its own interests, even if that ruffles a few feathers. How viable is that? Is that even possible now in this very polarized world we're in?
Well, you know, India is going to pursue its national interest, come what may. Now, that national interest dictates a few sort of global vision views. One is that we would not like to see the emergence of a hegemon on the Asian continent. Now, if that is to happen, then we have to try and make sure that the condominium between Russia and China does not become a very tight embrace, that there is daylight between the two. So India is going to do everything that it can with whatever capacities it has to keep Russia as far away as possible from China, particularly because India does not have a very comfortable relationship with China at this stage. That is point one. Point two, India is at a stage of development where it would like to keep good relations with all great powers. And Russia is certainly, from an Indian perspective, a great power. So is the United States. So is China, for that matter. So therefore, as I said earlier, I don't think India at any point of time is even considering dilution of its relationship with Russia. It may not have the same salience as when the Soviet Union was around, but it is still one of the more important relationships, bilateral relationships that India has.
Dimitri, optics count for a lot these days, don't they? And you know, you mentioned about this this perception that Russia is isolated and how Putin will be working to counter that. How important is that in the general scheme of things? Among the other things you mentioned, Russia trying to show by shaking Putin's hand, the Prime Minister of India, that he is still a serious global power.
Yes, it's very important, not only for Russia, but globally. In a way, one of the reasons why it is possible for Russia to have good relations both with China and with India is that we are all members of the BRICS organization. And the BRICS, as well as Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these are very diverse organizations. Somehow, when the West is putting very tight requirements on its members, G7 countries, BRICS, we have all kinds of countries there. We have countries that are called democratic by the West. We have countries which are called authoritarian. Inside, for example, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we have countries that are called communist dictatorship. We have countries which are called basically democratic republics or even monarchies. You know, BRICS is now having Arab countries, inviting them for cooperation. So in this way, Russia is sending a message. Look, we are all different, but we can work for the survival of humanity. We can prevent conflicts together. I think India and China have understanding for Russia's predicament in Ukraine. They agree that this was not an unprovoked war, as the Western media says. Russia was provoked many times before this tragedy started seriously in 2022. And since 2014, since the coup in Kiev, which was very violent, in which 38 policemen were killed, We have been living through a series of provocations. So I think this is something that India and China understand because they have been provoked. India has been provoked into a conflict with Pakistan. China is constantly accused by the United States and Western powers of being somehow aggressive, even though China, in the last at least 40 years since the Vietnam War, a brief Vietnam-Chinese war, China has not attacked any other single country, unlike the Western countries, which have been waging wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in many other countries, as we know. So this is the message, not only for our own self-satisfaction. We don't feel isolated anyway, but this is the message for the global South, which is the majority of humanity.
Robert, one of the challenges that India is facing right now, of course, is this 25% tariff that the U.S. slapped on them earlier this year. What was behind that decision, and has it antagonized the relationship needlessly and perhaps run the risk of bringing India closer to Russia?
So, look, the Trump administration's explanation for the decision was India's imports of Russian oil, and it was during one of the Trump administration's multiple changes in direction as to how it approaches ending the conflict in Ukraine. At times, it tries to pressure Ukraine, which I think is a dead-end policy. Ukraine clearly is interested in peace, as long as it's a just peace that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty and at least part of its territorial integrity. Russia's not interested in peace, but this was an attempt by the Trump administration to put some moderate pressure on Russia through its trading partners by trying to impel or induce India to reduce its imports of Russian oil to avoid funding the Russian war machine. It looks like it's been moderately successful. India has dropped the imports of Russian oil. They had gone from about 2.5% of Indian oil was imported from Russia to 35% after the start of the full-scale invasion. It's dropped since the tariff. So that was the goal. It's been moderately successful. I need to address Dmitri's statement that the invasion of Ukraine was provoked. It was completely unprovoked. It was illegal. Ukraine did not threaten Russia in any way. There were no Nazis in Ukraine. There were no nuclear weapons. There was no NATO in Ukraine. Ukraine was not about to join NATO. It was not close to NATO. It's actually far closer now to NATO membership or some sort of enforceable security guarantees than it was before Russia decided to invade in 2022. And we need to also remember that this was not the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It was the second. The first was in 2014 when they seized Crimea and started a war in eastern Ukraine. There was also the 2008 invasion of Georgia. So Dmitri's correct that India and China have not been going around invading their neighbors. Russia has, and that's what differentiates it from its partners in the SCO and the BRICS.
All right, I'm sure Dmitri's going to want to respond to some of that, but I want to bring this discussion back to India for a moment and turn back to you on this, Nandan, the tariffs. What effect did that have inside, has that had inside India and on the economy there and its relations with Russia? Because, here is a country coming for a visit, and they're not slapping 25% tariffs on us.
Well, the tariffs which have been imposed by the United States are painful because the United States is India's largest export market. And when its goods become uncompetitive on the US market, we unfortunately in such a short span of time are unable to find other markets to sell these goods. So it effectively becomes unproductive economically, and there are losses to be borne. That is one. There is, of course, a political fallout, which the United States does not understand at this point of time. But the trust that was developed between the United States and India over the past decade of closer and closer relationships has unfortunately been significantly undermined. And today, we are back to the days of the Soviet Union where America was looked on with a bit of suspicion. And this is presumably because of the unpredictability of the partnership with America right now with President Trump. However, India is also keenly aware of the fact that given its developmental challenges, it needs a very close economic relationship with the West. And therefore, all efforts will be made to try and reach a bilateral arrangement with the United States. That agreement is being negotiated as we speak, and hopefully by the year end, there will be some kind of agreement in place. So India will have to, has a tight sort of rope to walk on, but well, I'm not sort of beating my chest about it, but we have done it in the past, and I think we have a fairly skilled leadership that is capable of dealing with this situation.
Dmitry, Putin is of course, hoping that India goes back to buying more Russian oil. But how is that going to work with the sanctions in place? Is there a kind of cost analysis calculation that that India has to make here? How can that work in Russia's favor?
Well, surprised as you may be, but Russia believes in market economy. If there is a market for Russian oil, the buyer will find a way to buy Russian oil at a realistic price. So when the United States tries to put a cap on the price of Russian oil, and when the EU is trying to do the same, they will fail, just like the Soviet Union failed to build a prosperous society without market economy. If you go against the market, sooner or later you will lose. And certainly this is the logic behind Putin's visit to India. And we can see that he is well received because India doesn't like to be pressured. I mean, let me remind you that Prime Minister Modi didn't take phone calls from President Trump for several weeks after Trump, made it in such a rude way, putting pressure on India, like drop the Russian oil export or oil imports, or you will face increased tariffs. This was pure blackmail. So basically, Russia's stake is on the sovereignty of India, sovereignty of China, sovereignty of Turkey. And so far, this bet has worked. And in general, look at what's going on. The United States and the EU, when they provoked Russia into this war in Ukraine, they thought that Russia would be crushed by sanctions. And it didn't happen. Why? Because Russia is really not the Soviet Union. We have market economy. In a market economy, if someone stops supplying something to you, you just find another source. There are lots of people bidding all kinds of benefits, all kinds of deals when you have a market economy. So I'm absolutely sure Russia will survive whatever sanctions will be imposed on it. And certainly India will be happy to have full economic cooperation with Russia, which is beneficial for both countries. We'll see it continued, and there is no doubt about that. I'm not going to argue about the past, but the fact that such big countries, such important countries, the majority of humanity, India and China, have respect for Russia's position. The fact that they didn't buy the Western narrative that somehow Russia is always to blame for everything, it shows that we have a point. And Russia is being hurt in the war, especially in China, India, Arab countries, the majority of humanity.
Robert Hamilton, how is the US going to be looking at this if India does resume buying more Russian oil?
Well, I think the tariffs will stay in place, and President Trump might raise the tariffs. Who knows? So, look, two things maybe Dmitry and I can agree on is one, the sanctions have been less effective than many Western countries thought they would be, and that's for several reasons. One, Putin spent since 2014 to 2022 sanctions proofing his economy in any way he could because he expected increased sanctions on Russia. So Russia is more resilient, has been more resilient, but that resiliency has an endpoint. The other reason the sanctions have been less effective than people in the West hoped, I think, is because, frankly, there are Western countries and Western companies putting profit over respecting the sanctions, and they are making deals with Russia to go around the sanctions. So this is not just India and China. This is also European countries and some U.S. partners and allies and some U.S. companies frankly, are still making money in and on Russia. And then the other thing I think we can is the tariff program has been largely incoherent and frankly not that effective. Of course, it depends on what you think the goal of the tariffs are. If you believe the goal of the tariffs are to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., hasn't happened and won't happen. The economy doesn't work that way, the global economy. If you believe it's leverage over partners and allies, it's been effective in some cases, but in others it hasn't. In India, to this point at least, has been one of those cases where it's only been marginally effective. India has moderately or marginally decreased its imports of Russian oil, but hasn't stopped it altogether.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Nandan Unnikrishnan, Dmitry Babich, and Robert Hamilton. Thanks very much for being with us. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. We'll see you next time.